3 years ago, I learned something about power that nobody ever tells you. Most people think power belongs to whoever has the title, the authority, the fancy letterhead, or the biggest office. Turns out, real power often belongs to the person who and oppose is willing to read the fine print. I learned that lesson the day I came home and found $22,000 worth of solar panels covered in bright orange violation notices, like somebody had wrapped my roof in caution tape and declared war on common sense. I remember just sitting in my truck for a minute. The engine was still running. The radio was playing. But all I could do was stare. 3 months of planning. Endless paperwork. County permits. Engineering approvals. Licensed installers. Inspections. Everything done by the book. And now there were giant orange stickers plastered across every panel. Stop work order. Unauthorized installation. Subject to daily penalties. I honestly thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe somebody mixed up addresses. Maybe there was a paperwork issue. Then I noticed the envelope taped to my front door. That was when I saw the name. Oak Hollow Community Association. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. I didn't oppose to live in Oak Hollow. My property sat just outside their development. My farmhouse had been sitting on those 5 acres since before most of Oak Hollow even existed. The subdivision was barely 6 years old. My house was almost 40. Yet somehow they had decided they could tell me what belonged on my roof. I walked inside carrying the notice and showed it to my wife, Claire. She read it twice. Then she looked at me and said exactly what I was thinking. End quote. They can and oppose. T actually do this. Can they? End quote. End quote. I don't and oppose. T thinks so. End quote. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was worried about the panels. I was angry. There and oppose. Essay difference. Worry makes you feel helpless. Anger makes you start asking questions. The next morning, I called the number listed on the notice. After bouncing through a few transfers, I eventually reached the HOA president. His name was Preston Hale. If you and oppose, VE, ever met somebody who mistakes confidence for intelligence, you and oppose, LL know exactly the kind of voice he had. Smooth. Condescending. Like every sentence ended with an invisible pat on the head. End quote. Mr. Carter, end quote. He said, end quote. I understand you and oppose. Recalling regarding the architectural violation. End quote. End quote. Architectural violation? End quote. I repeated. End quote. They and oppose. Solar panels. End quote. End quote. They are non-conforming visual structures. End quote. I had to pull the phone away from my ear for a second. Non-conforming visual structures. The guy was talking about solar panels like they were nuclear waste barrels. End quote. My property ISN and oppose. T inside your HOA. End quote. There was a pause. Then came a little chuckle. The kind that instantly makes your blood pressure rise. End quote. Recent county guidance gives neighboring associations authority to review installations that impact community character. End quote. Community character. There were those words again. I asked him to show me the regulation. He promised he and oppose. D send it over. He never did. Instead, I got another notice. Then another. Each one threatening daily fines. Each one sounding more aggressive than the last. That was when something started bothering me. Not the threats. The confidence. Preston sounded way too sure of himself. People who are bluffing usually leave room for uncertainty. He didn't and oppose. T. Which meant one of two things. Either he was right, or he and oppose. D been getting away with being wrong for a very long time. I started digging. Public records. County ordinances. Meeting minutes. Building department documents. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The county absolutely had updated its renewable energy guidelines. But the actual language said almost the exact opposite of what Preston claimed. The regulations specifically protected homeowners from unreasonable restrictions on solar installations. The more I read, the more obvious it became. He wasn't oppose. T misunderstanding the law. He was counting on nobody else reading it. That should have been the end of the story. Call an attorney. Send a letter. Get the notices removed. Move on. But then I stumbled across something else. Something that changed everything. Oak Hollow had been developed by a company called Meridian Residential Partners. Locally, they had a reputation. Not a terrible one. Just the kind that made contractors raise an eyebrow. Fast builds. Aggressive timelines. Cost-cutting. Corners trimmed wherever nobody was looking. I started remembering conversations I and oppose. D heard over the years. Electricians complaining at supply stores. Inspectors making offhand comments at county meetings. Nothing specific. Just enough smoke to make me wonder if there might be fire somewhere. A week later, I met up with an old friend named Travis Monroe. Travis worked as an electrical compliance consultant. Not exactly an inspector. More like the guy inspectors called when things got complicated. We met at a little barbecue place outside town. Nothing fancy. Plastic baskets. Paper napkins. Sweet tea. The kind of place where conversations tend to get honest. At some point I mentioned Oak Hollow. Travis looked up from his brisket. End quote. Why? End quote. End quote. No reason. End quote. I said. End quote. Just curious. End quote. He laughed. End quote. Nobody says they and oppos. Re-curious about Oak Hollow unless they and oppos. Re-about to tell a story. End quote. So I told him. The notices. The threats. The HOA president. The fake regulations. Everything. By the time I finished, Travis was shaking his head. End quote. That and oppos. S bold. End quote. End quote. That and oppos. S one word for it. End quote. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. End quote. What? End quote. He took a sip of tea. End quote. You know what and oppos. S funny. End quote. End quote. What? End quote. End quote. A lot of developments built during that construction boom got inspected way faster than they probably should have. End quote. I leaned forward. End quote. Meaning? End quote. He shrugged. End quote. Meaning sometimes things get missed. End quote. I sat there quietly, then asked the question that would end up changing everything. End quote. If somebody had concerns about electrical safety in a neighborhood, what happens? End quote. Travis smiled. Not a happy smile. More like the smile of somebody who already knew where this conversation was heading. End quote. Depends how serious the concerns are. End quote. End quote. And if they and oppos, serious? End quote. He set his glass down. End quote. Then people start showing up with clipboards. End quote. I remember driving home that night with the windows down and the radio off. Just thinking about Preston, thinking about those notices, thinking about the confidence in his voice. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I wasn't oppos, angry anymore. I was curious. Because if there was one thing I and oppos, learned in life, it and oppos, that's that people who spend all their time policing everyone else usually pray nobody looks too closely at what and oppos is happening in their own backyard. And about 48 hours later, somebody finally did. The first inspection truck rolled into Oak Hollow on a Tuesday morning. I know that because I was drinking coffee on my back porch when I saw it pass the entrance road. White county vehicle. Official markings. 2 inspectors inside. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make anyone nervous. At least not yet. I remember thinking, that and oppos, it? After everything that had happened, I expected sirens or flashing lights or some big government operation. Instead, it looked like 2 guys showing up to do paperwork. By lunchtime, there were 3 more trucks. By Wednesday morning, there were 6. That and oppos. When I realized something bigger was happening. The first few homes they checked had apparently been selected at random. No targeting. No accusations. Just routine verification. And somehow those routine checks kept uncovering problems. Small things at first. Incorrect grounding. Improper breaker labeling. Missing documentation. Nothing catastrophic. Then one of the inspectors found an undersized service panel. That led to another. Then another. Then another. By the end of the week, county officials weren't and oppos performing random checks anymore. They were conducting a full-scale review. Word traveled fast. Small towns are like that. You can spend millions on marketing and still not spread information as quickly as one nervous homeowner talking to another over a backyard fence. Soon everyone was talking. At the grocery store. At church. At Little League games. At gas stations. Every conversation somehow found its way back to Oak Hollow. Then the stories started getting stranger. One resident claimed electricians had discovered overloaded circuits. Another said entire sections of underground wiring failed modern specifications. Someone else swore half the development had been built using substitute materials during supply shortages years earlier. Nobody knew exactly what was true, but everybody knew something was wrong, including Preston. I saw him for the first time about 2 weeks into the inspections. I was leaving a hardware store when he came walking out. Normally, he dressed like a politician running for re-election. Perfect polo shirt. Pressed khakis. Expensive sunglasses. Everything carefully curated. That day he looked exhausted. The sunglasses couldn't and oppose. T hide the dark circles. The forced smile couldn't and oppose. T hide the stress. For a second our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. But there was something satisfying about that moment. Not because he looked miserable. Because he finally looked human. For months he and oppose. D acted like some untouchable authority figure handing down rulings from above. Now he looked like every other guy dealing with consequences. I got into my truck and drove away. A few days later, Claire asked me a question I wasn't and oppose. T prepared for. We were eating dinner. Nothing special. Just leftovers and iced tea. She put her fork down. End quote. Do you feel bad about any of this? End quote. I knew exactly what she meant. The inspections. The disruption. The chaos spreading through the neighborhood. I thought about it for a minute. End quote. Honestly? End quote. She nodded. End quote. I feel bad for the homeowners. End quote. That part was true. Most of those families had done nothing wrong. They bought houses. Trusted builders. Trusted inspections. Trusted people who were supposed to know what they were doing. Now they were stuck dealing with the fallout. Claire nodded slowly. End quote. But not Preston. End quote. I laughed. End quote. No, not Preston. End quote. The truth was more complicated than revenge. I wasn't and oppose. T enjoying other people and oppose as problems. What bothered me was watching someone abuse authority because he assumed nobody would challenge him. People like Preston count on something. They count on exhaustion. They count on intimidation. They count on the fact that most people have jobs and families and responsibilities, and Don and oppose. T have time to fight every unfair thing that happens. The entire system depends on compliance. The moment someone pushes back, everything gets uncomfortable. 3 weeks after the inspections began, things escalated again. County officials held a public information meeting. The room was packed. Homeowners filled every chair. People lined the walls. Some stood in hallways. I wasn't and oppose. T planning to attend. Then curiosity got the better of me. So Claire and I went. What happened that night changed the entire atmosphere. The lead engineer presented the findings. Dozens of deficiencies. Improper installations. Code violations. Safety concerns. Documentation discrepancies. The projected repair costs made people audibly gasp. Hundreds of thousands. Then more. Then significantly more. One homeowner stood up. End quote. How did this pass inspection in the first place? End quote. Nobody had a good answer. Another asked whether the developer knew. Again, no clear answer. Then someone asked about the HOA. That was when all eyes turned toward Preston. I still remember the expression on his face. He wasn't and oppose. T angry. He wasn't and oppose. T defensive. He looked trapped. For years, the HOA had focused on things like mailbox colors, holiday decorations, fence heights, landscaping standards, roof appearance. Meanwhile, serious infrastructure concerns had apparently gone unnoticed. The contrast wasn't and oppose. T helping him. Not at all. Questions started coming from every direction. Some fair, some hostile, some emotional. People wanted accountability. And accountability is a difficult thing to provide when you and oppose. VE spent years presenting yourself as the guardian of community standards. After the meeting, residents gathered outside in little groups. Talking, arguing, comparing notes. For the first time, the conversation wasn't and oppose. T about solar panels. It wasn't and oppose. T about aesthetics. It wasn't and oppose. T about community image. It was about trust. And once trust starts cracking, it rarely breaks in a straight line. A month later, Oak Hollow looked completely different. Construction crews were everywhere. Driveways filled with contractor vehicles. Temporary trenches cut through sections of landscaping. Generators humming. Equipment stacked along curbs. The neighborhood that had once been obsessed with appearances now looked like an active construction site. The irony was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, I sat on my porch watching workers replace part of a utility connection near the subdivision entrance. I remember thinking how quiet life had been before all this. Then my phone rang. The caller ID surprised me. Preston Hale. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. End quote. Hello. End quote. There was a pause. Then his voice. Different this time. Much different. No arrogance. No superiority. No rehearsed confidence. Just fatigue. End quote. Mr. Carter. End quote. End quote. Preston. End quote. End quote. I was hoping we could talk. End quote. I leaned back in my chair. End quote. About what? End quote. Another pause. End quote. Your solar installation. End quote. There it was. The subject he and Oppos. D spent months trying to control. Now suddenly he wanted a conversation. I almost laughed. End quote. Seems a little late for that. End quote. End quote. I understand. End quote. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Not weak. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes from fighting multiple fires at once. End quote. We and Oppos. D like to resolve the situation. End quote. End quote. We. End quote. End quote. The board. End quote. I looked toward Oak Hollow. Even from my property, I could hear distant construction equipment. The soundtrack of accountability. End quote. What exactly does resolving it mean? End quote. End quote. We and Oppos. D like to meet. End quote. I told him I and Oppos. D think about it. Then I hung up. That evening Claire found me sitting outside. The sun was setting. The fields behind our house glowed orange. For a while neither of us spoke. Then she asked the obvious question. End quote. What are you going to do? End quote. I stared toward the horizon. End quote. I dawned and Oppos. T no. End quote. And I truly didn't and Oppos. T. Part of me wanted to drag the fight out. After everything Preston had put us through, that would have been easy, maybe even satisfying. But another part of me kept remembering something my grandfather used to say. When somebody finally realizes they and Oppos, wrong, that and Oppos, that's the moment you find out whether you and Oppos, seeking justice or revenge. The problem is, those two things can feel remarkably similar. A few days later, Preston arrived at my house. Not with lawyers, not with board members, just him. One man walking up my driveway carrying the weight of an entire neighborhood and Oppos' frustration on his shoulders. I invited him onto the porch. Neither of us rushed into the conversation. The silence hung there for a while. Finally, he looked out toward the distant construction crews and sighed. End quote. I made mistakes. End quote. I didn't and Oppos. T say anything. He continued. End quote. I thought I was protecting the community. End quote. There it was. The first honest thing I and Oppos, D heard from him. Because that and Oppos, that's what made this situation complicated. Preston wasn't and Oppos, T some cartoon villain. He wasn't and Oppos, T waking up every morning trying to ruin lives. He genuinely believed he was protecting property values and preserving the image of the neighborhood. The problem was that somewhere along the way, he stopped questioning whether he actually had the right to make those decisions for everyone else. Power has a way of doing that. It slowly convinces people that their preferences are the same thing as principles. And once that happens, bad decisions start feeling justified. We sat there for a long time talking. Not arguing. Talking. And eventually the conversation turned toward a resolution. But before any agreement could happen, there was one final thing Preston needed to understand. Because this had never really been about solar panels. It had always been about something much bigger. And what happened next would decide whether this story ended with accountability or just another powerful person escaping the consequences of his own actions. I wish I could tell you there was some dramatic showdown after that. Some movie scene where Preston and I stood face to face, trading insults while construction equipment exploded in the background. Real life usually ISN and Oppos. T that clean. What happened instead was something quieter. And somehow, that made it hit harder. Preston sat across from me on that porch for nearly 2 hours. The sun slowly dropped behind the trees. The sounds of construction drifted across the fields every few minutes. Neither of us was in a hurry anymore. For the first time since this entire mess started, there was an Oppos, T an audience. No HOA board. No attorneys. No homeowners. No official notices. Just two men talking about a problem that had grown much bigger than either of us expected. At one point, he looked down at the violation notice I and Oppos. D kept folded inside a folder on the table. The very first one. The one that started everything. End quote. I shouldn't and Oppos. T have sent that. End quote. It wasn't and Oppos. T an excuse. It wasn't and Oppos. T a justification. It was simply an admission. And oddly enough, that mattered. Because accountability starts with honesty. Without that, everything else is just public relations. I nodded toward the folder. End quote. You know what bothered me most? End quote. He looked up. End quote. The notice? End quote. I shook my head. End quote. No. The assumption? End quote. End quote. What assumption? End quote. End quote. That I and Apos. D just accept it. End quote. That seemed to land. Because that was the heart of the entire situation. The notice wasn't Apos. T really about solar panels. It was about authority. Somewhere along the line, Preston and the board had become so accustomed to people complying that they stopped questioning where their authority actually ended. And when someone challenged it, they reacted as if the challenge itself was the problem. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he finally said something I hadn't and Apos. T expected. End quote. You weren't and Apos. T the first homeowner. End quote. I frowned. End quote. What do you mean? End quote. He leaned back in his chair. End quote. There were others. End quote. People who wanted things that didn't and Apos. T fit community standards. Energy-efficient upgrades. Alternative landscaping. Workshop additions. Different fencing materials. Most eventually gave up. Some couldn't and Apos. T afford legal fights. Others didn't and Apos. T want the stress. A few simply got tired. The more he talked, the more I realized something. The system had never depended on being right. It depended on people being exhausted. That realization stayed with me. Because honestly, it bothered me more than the notices ever had. A week later, attorneys representing the HOA delivered a formal agreement. Every violation notice was withdrawn. Every threat of fines disappeared. The board issued written confirmation acknowledging that my solar installation fully complied with county regulations. They also agreed to reimburse the contractor expenses I and Apos D incurred because of project delays. But there was one clause I requested personally. A public clarification. Not for revenge. Not for humiliation. For transparency. If the board had publicly accused me, then the correction deserved to be public too. To my surprise, they agreed. The following county meeting was crowded. Word had spread. People wanted updates about construction repairs, inspection findings, costs, liability, the usual small-town drama. Toward the end of the meeting, Preston stood and approached the podium. I Don and Apos. T think I and Apos. LL ever forget that moment. Not because it was triumphant, because it was uncomfortable. You could see it on his face. Nobody enjoys admitting they were wrong in front of hundreds of people. Yet there he was. He cleared his throat, then read the statement. The board had incorrectly interpreted the regulations. My solar installation complied with county requirements. The notices had been withdrawn. The matter was resolved. Simple, direct, honest. The room remained quiet. Then something unexpected happened. People applauded. Not for me. Not even for Preston. For the fact that someone had finally told the truth. That applause probably lasted only a few seconds. But it felt longer. Afterward, homeowners approached me in the parking lot. Some thanked me. Others shared stories of their own disagreements with the HOA. One man laughed and said he and Apos D never looked up county regulations before this whole mess. Now he read everything. That might have been my favorite outcome of all. People started asking questions. Not angry questions. Responsible ones. The kind that healthy communities need. Meanwhile, the repairs inside Oak Hollow continued for months. Crews replaced equipment, upgraded systems, corrected deficiencies. The final cost estimates climbed well past what anyone initially expected. It was expensive, embarrassing, frustrating. But according to the engineers, it made the neighborhood significantly safer. And honestly, if there was any silver lining in the entire ordeal, maybe that was it. As for my solar panels, they and Apos VE been running ever since. Every now and then I and Apos LL glance at the monitoring app on my phone and smile. Not because of the savings, although those are nice. Not because I won. Because every time I see those numbers, I and Apos am reminded of something important. Most conflicts aren't in Apos. T really about the issue people argue over. The issue is usually just the surface. Underneath, it and Apos, that's about respect, boundaries, control, pride, fear, sometimes all at once. Looking back now, I Don and Apos, T hate Preston. I Don and Apos, T even think he and Apos, S a bad person. I think he made the same mistake a lot of people make when they and Apos re-given authority. He stopped distinguishing between what he preferred and what he had the right to demand. That and Apos, S a dangerous line to blur. And if I and Apos am being honest, the whole experience changed me too. I became less willing to accept things simply because somebody sounded confident. Less willing to assume authority automatically means correctness. more willing to ask questions, more willing to verify, more willing to push back when something doesn't and oppose T feel right. But here and oppose, that's the part I and oppose am still not sure about. Sometimes I wonder what would and oppose VE happened if I and oppose D simply taken the panels down. Would life have been easier? Probably. Would the inspections have happened? Maybe not. Would all those electrical problems have remained hidden? Possibly. And that and oppose, that's the question that still sticks with me. Because depending on how you look at it, I either protected my rights and exposed a serious problem, or I pulled a thread that unraveled an entire community. So now I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought back the way I did? Would you have challenged the HOA, researched the regulations, and pushed until the truth came out? Or would you have chosen peace over conflict and moved on? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. And if you and oppose VE ever dealt with power-hungry organizations, difficult neighbors, HOA battles, or situations where standing up for yourself came with unexpected consequences, share your story too. Don and oppose. Forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more real stories about conflict, community, justice, and the moments that force ordinary people to decide exactly where they and oppose willing to draw the line.